from Germany, Marburg, Germany. I'm retired, so I'm not doing anything anymore, except for being here. I'm involved in a Bible translation project in the Sudan and Egypt, so that's what I'm focusing on at the moment. I am a church founder, church planter, you probably say in English. We started a university church many years ago in Marburg, Germany, where I was a student. That was when I was 24 years old. That church has grown. We handed over leadership about 10 years ago. We have plants in Berlin. We have a center in Jerusalem, in the old city. We have another plant in our own town, so it has really grown. And so we're thankful to God for that. And I'm also teaching at a theological seminary, teaching Islam and Christianity, and also church in a global context. So basically, I'm very much interested in world mission. I'm interested in linguistics. And the last 5 or 6 years, I've developed this interest in the early church. And meaning the 300 years, more or less, from the time of Pentecost in the year 30, probably, to what we call the Constantinian turnover, when Emperor Constantine, allowed Christianity as a legitimate or permitted religion, religio licita or licita in Latin. So that was 311, 313. So basically it's about 280 years. And that is the time that I'm looking at the moment. I'm writing a book at the moment about it. I've done a lot of videos on this in German. So those of you who know German or have the gift of interpretation, you can just look at those YouTube videos. So that's why when they asked me to be a speaker here, what do you know? What can you contribute that maybe others do not? That would be specific or helpful. I said, well, I can do something about the early church. So that is why I'm doing this. By way of introduction, I would like to define, first of all, the period we're speaking about, the geography we're speaking about, and then also the sources. So, as I said, when we speak about the early church, there's two meanings attached to it. Sometimes people use the term in a more narrow, restricted way, which means, say, the early church in Jerusalem, or maybe the time of the apostles. So that's one way. I like to use the term early church as leading up to the turn of the 3rd to the 4th century, namely 311, 313, maximum 325, the Council of Nicaea. So those 300 early years of the church, when basically the church was not yet allied with any political system. But the Christians were in a minority situation, and they were in a situation of powerlessness. And the book I'm writing at the moment about the early church actually has this title in German, ohnmächtig, which is powerless, without power. But that is outward power. But if they didn't have that power, they didn't have the institutions, they didn't have church buildings, at least not in the first 150 years. Then slowly church buildings came about. They did not have any political representation. Rather, they were persecuted. They were misunderstood. And yet they grew from a small group of followers of Jesus Christ. The day of Pentecost, 3,000 were baptized, we read in Acts 2. And then at the time that Constantine comes, the Emperor Constantine, people say maybe a 10% of the Roman Empire was Christian. It is always very, very hard to say, nobody was there was no census taken, so these are estimates. I tend to think that it was probably a little bit less, but I also believe that it was in pockets. So they were like pockets where Christianity was very strong. Western Asia, Western Minor Asia, meaning what we call now the western part of Turkey. Maybe in Rome, Italy, maybe also in southern France, Gaul. I mean, all of that was part of the Roman Empire. Maybe also North Africa, which is nowadays Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, which nowadays has almost no Christians. So those would probably be strong pockets, but there would be other areas of the Roman Empire where maybe the Christian population was not very strong. And also, it was stronger in the urban centers than it was on the countryside. That's, by the way, where the term pagan comes from. Paganus in Latin means someone who lives on the countryside. Okay? Isn't that interesting? Why is that? That is because the Christians were concentrated, especially in the 3rd and 4th century, and then as Christianity became official, they were still more represented in the towns and the cities, the large urban centers, but those people out there who maybe didn't even speak Greek or Latin, they had their Celtic language, or they had their Germanic languages, or their Slavic languages. So the barbarians, as the Greek called them, from the word barbaros, which means he's just going barbar, barbar, barbar. Nobody can understand them. Okay, so those barbarians, they were not so much touched. So how did this happen? How can a religion that is persecuted, is misrepresented, misunderstood, how can that grow without the help of any institutional power, without the help of military advancement or any outward force? So how did that happen? That's what interests me. Because, and that's where we come to some of what you have said in the beginning, we are moving into a time, I think also in the West, where our structures of power are dismantled. Like in Germany, where I am from, we used to have what is called the Landeskirche, or the state church, you can say. It is not exactly a state church, but that's probably the closest English term there is. So from the time of the Reformation, people were either Catholic or they were Protestant. If they were Protestant, they would be organized in regional churches. And after all the wars that they had between the Catholics and the Protestants, they came up with the rule of cuius regio eius religio, which means, as Latin means, whoever's territory it is, that person's religion it will be. So if the prince of, or say the duke or the count of a certain area was Catholic, then all the subjects would be Catholic. And if he turned Protestant, then everyone else had to turn Protestant too. And there's like the town where my brother used to live in northern Germany, they changed back and forth from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic to Protestant several times, according to who was the ruler. So that shows something about the power connection between the connection of power, secular power, to the church. Like in England, for the Anglican Church, the king is the official head of the church, okay? When the English Reformation happened, the king decided to disassociate from Rome. So instead of having the Pope as the supreme head, the English king became the supreme head of the Anglican Church. And that's the same way it was in Germany and in most of Europe. So, of course, even in those situations, but I don't want to go into medieval and post-Reformation history a lot, but just to say there, of course, they were always minorities. So the Slovak people in Serbia, you're Slovak, right? He's Slovak, sorry. Slovak people in Serbia, they were allowed to remain Protestants by Maria Theresia, the Empress of Hungary, who was a strong proponent of the Catholic religion, under condition that they moved to the southern border over against the Ottoman Empire and strengthened that area which was depopulated after the wars, which Austria-Hungary took, and then there was not so many people. So she said, okay, you Slovak people, you can go there and remain Protestants, otherwise I will force you to become Catholics. So there's a lot of, I could now go on and give you many, many examples of the connection of power and church. Now, when America was founded, the US, the United States were founded, that was one of their main tenets, to separate state and church, to not do what was the norm in Europe. Why was that? Because they were often those people who dissented. So the dissenters, the pilgrims, people who maybe because of reasons of conscience said, we do not want to be part of the Catholic Church or the Protestant Lutheran or Protestant Reformed state church. So we are dissenting, and then they got into trouble, like the Mennonites. They were pushed out of Germany and out of Holland. They fled to the Russian Empire, and finally many of them settled in Paraguay, and many in Canada, and many in the United States. So that happened with many groups, and if you go through American church history, you will see a lot of this. And you will see that that is one of the things that they did not want. And of course, question mark, nowadays sometimes you see in America the tendency also to politicize the faith. So if you're a Christian, you go with that party. But that is somehow historically strange, a little bit strange. Okay, but I want to go back to the first 3 centuries. So we see the growth of a small group of Christians, of believers in Jesus Christ. Through these centuries, they were not favored by the government. They were not favored by outward circumstances, but they grew. And so how did that happen? Of course, you have the attachment, and I've written something there, but so I'm trying to speak more in a free way. And if anyone wants to ask a question or intervene, contradict, or give some other insight, you're very welcome. Okay, so we're a small group and we can do that. So basically, we have the testimony, and I will use the Greek word of testimony, for testimony, the martyrion. Okay, so Latin would be martyrium. We know this word from martyr, okay? So martyr means witness. That's all it means. So the martyrion is the witness of the early church. So how did their witness happen? Jesus says in Acts 1, verse 8, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you shall be my witnesses. And he uses this word martyres. So martys is a witness, and martyrion is the witness. So how did this witness take flesh? What was included in this witness of the early church? And I just want to remind us of the verse in Revelations where it says, they overcame by the witness and by not loving their lives unto death. So that's what they had. They did not have political power. They did not have a lot of friends in high places, but they had their witness. Now, how was this witness expressed? And I would say there is 3 main expressions. There's more expressions, and we will come to that. It was expressed in word, and I will speak more about that. It was expressed in life or deed. I will take those two. So I'm meaning that the way that they lived. And it was expressed in community. Of course, they're all connected. So, excuse me if that's a little bit. So, of course, the life and the community is connected. And, of course, the word and the deed are connected. So, a Christian or a believer in Jesus, of course, the name Christian came about, and we can read that in Acts. The first times they were called Christians was in the city of Antioch. So it is a Greek way of saying Messiah followers. Okay, the word Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, was translated as Christos in Greek, Christ in English. And then so they became the Christianoi, plural. Christianos is one person, a Christian. And by the way, this name was very important to them. Welcome. Come on in. This name was very important to them, and we see this in the Acts of the Martyrs. When they died as martyrs in the Roman Colosseum or in the amphitheaters of North Africa or in Lyon, the martyrs of Lyon, the over 50 people who died in the year 177. They often, in their defense, they just said, Christianos sum, which is Latin, I'm a Christian. So what do you have to say in your defense, you know? What did you do? And it just says, I'm a Christian, which is actually a self-indictment. It actually means, okay, you can kill me because I'm a Christian, okay? So this name of Christian was very important to them. So these Christians started living in a new way, their life. They lived a new community, and they had a message to share. Now let's look at the message for a moment, and then we'll look at the life of the community and other things that flow out of that. So let's say, okay, before I say, I want to just take a little bit of something here in between, and that is, how do we know all of this? Okay, so many of us, Christian believers of the 21st century, we know, or we should know, the Bible or the New Testament. So how far does the Bible take us in time? What's the time frame that the New Testament takes us? Any ideas? Any suggestions?
Acts and John 1:60, the year 60.
You say the year 60? 62. Why is that?
So the year when Paul is in Rome.
Okay. That's a very good argument, yes. For the Acts of the Apostles take us till Paul's imprisonment in Rome, probably his first imprisonment. Probably he was released and then went to Spain, went to the east, went to Spain, and was imprisoned a second time, and he was killed in the middle of the 60s. So historically, we are like going till the 60s. Any other suggestions? Early 90s, why is that?
I think the letter John's letters were written around that time.
Okay, let's suppose they were written in the 80s or maybe late 80s or even 90s. Anyway, by the time of the turn of the century, the end of the first century, the New Testament time is closed, okay? So many Christians know that period more or less because they read the Bible. But when I ask people about what happened after that, tell me names that are important in the 2nd century and in the 3rd century. Now this group is probably an elite group. You probably all know this. But if I ask, if you go to a church and there's 1,000 people sitting, this doesn't happen a lot in Germany, but maybe in the States, but say in Germany you have 100 people or 150 people. I ask them, give me the name of a church leader of the 2nd century. I would be lucky if one person knows one name, right? So what do people know about church history? I don't know what you know in America or in Lithuania or in Slovakia or in... Maybe we know the Reformation, Martin Luther, okay? In Germany they will say Bonhoeffer. We know Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Maybe some people say St. Augustine. Some people maybe say Francis of Assisi, St. Francis. Any more? Sometimes that's all people know. But actually, this time period that I'm trying to speaking about at the moment is so important. So how do we know anything about it? The answer is these books that I brought for you, okay? And many others. Let's say 3,000 other books, but these are the ones that fit into my suitcase. So one is, and that's very important, and I write that down, is Eusebius. Eusebius, I'll just write his name here. Eusebius of Caesarea. So I'll write him in the Latin way with the US. So Eusebius of Caesarea is the first church historian that we have. He was bishop of Caesarea, which is in modern-day Israel. So if you go to Israel, you can go to and see the amphitheater. Caesarea is the town where Paul was imprisoned for 2 years. It was called Caesarea. Why? Because it was a foundation in honor of the Kaiser, of the Caesar, of the emperor. So Caesarea had an early church, and it continued. And in that church, they had started collecting, like most other churches, they had started collecting books. And Eusebius was the leader or bishop of that church at the turn of the 3rd to the 4th century. So he experienced the last widespread persecution under Diocletian. And he also experienced the Council of Nicaea when Emperor Constantine convened all the bishops, and he was there also, and he died a few years later. So he, Eusebius of Caesarea, experienced this great shift from the church being powerless as a minority to being a permitted religion and being even sponsored by the emperor. And he loved books. So in the library, the church library of Caesarea, which has not survived because many books have not survived, and there was earthquakes, and there was fires, and there was the Muslims conquering, and or in the West it was the Germanic tribes, the Vandals and Goths and so forth, all these people, they burnt down the cities, burnt the manuscript and so forth. Anyway, at that time, his church library was full, and he even wrote a book just as a catalog of all the books in his library there. And he gives us the first church history from the time of the apostles to, come on in, from the time of the apostles to his time. So we are very fortunate to have this book. And anyone who is interested in this subject, please find any edition of the church history of Eusebius. I have an abbreviated version here by Paul Meyer. It's in English. It's very well done. I've read through this, I don't know, 3 or 4 times. I still find it interesting. It's still very good for me. So why is Eusebius important? He is important because he was a faithful transcriber of earlier manuscripts. I'll give you an example. There was a man called Papias of Hierapolis. Now, I don't know. Anyone has heard this name before? Sorry, this should be a P. Papias of Hierapolis. Raise your hands if you have heard this name. Okay. You could research him tonight on the internet, okay? So, Papias of Hierapolis. Very important person. We would not know about him unless Eusebius had written about him. So Papias still knew the Apostle John. Okay? He was a friend of Polycarp of Smyrna, another one who is my favorite. Actually, he is my favorite person in the 2nd century. His name is Polycarp, which means much fruit. I should probably stand up because if I write like that, I cannot even read my own writing. It's Polycarp, okay. So Polycarp of Smyrna. Now Papias, so Eusebius tells us, still knew the Apostle John and other people from the apostolic times. And he wrote 5 books about the Gospels, about the sayings of the Lord Jesus. Now, if anyone finds these books, I mean, that would be like a historic find. I mean, if you go through your own library, you find those books, you know, you will be famous and will be forever remembered. Maybe in some monastery in Bulgaria or in Greece or in Egypt, somewhere they're still there. Nobody has found them yet. Could be. We would never know. Now this man, Papias, who still knew the Apostle John and other people of the apostolic times, wrote 5 books about the sayings of the Lord Jesus, meaning the Gospels. Wouldn't it be great to have these books? We don't have them. They're lost. But we have a few quotations in Eusebius. And one of the things that Eusebius writes is that Papias said that Matthew was the first one to write a gospel in the Hebrew tongue. And after him, all the other evangelists. So who of you has learned that Matthew was the first to write a gospel? Probably no one. Normally we learn that what? Mark is the first one, right? Now I will not go into that because that's a big topic. And if you want, over lunch I can tell you what I think about that. But this is interesting. So we have more, and we have a lot of stuff in Eusebius. So we're talking about sources. Then there is a second stream of sources. So it's Eusebius and everything that he quoted from earlier writers. So thank you, Eusebius. Great guy. But there's also, and I just grabbed some of my books. One's called Early Christian Writings. This is a Penguin classic, so it should be easy to get. And you can look at those books in the break. Or Early Christian Fathers, and there's tons of books like that. So these are the earliest extra-canonical writings, meaning writings after the New Testament was finished, which, as we just heard from our friend, was around 80-90. Some people say Revelation was written in the 90s, but that's the end. I mean, some liberal theologians say that 2 Timothy and 2 Peter are even later. I don't think that. Anyway, turn of the century. Anything that came after the apostolic times, we're not included into the New Testament. Writings are not included into the New Testament, but are still very early. So let's just say, okay, I was born in 1957, okay. So I'm amongst the older ones here in this room. So, okay, if I tell you that, I will tell you that in the year 2000, I drove my Volkswagen from Frankfurt to Berlin, and then I could not continue on to Dresden and Leipzig and Warsaw because there was the Berlin Wall. What would you say? Yes. You would say it's not correct. Why?
Because it was
Why?
it was in 90s when it was stripped down. 89.
89, very good. So the Berlin Wall came down 89. Were you born in 89? Okay. How can you tell me it came down in 89 if you were not born yet?
Well, from other sources.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, all the fake news of television and yeah.
Then I'm not sure.
You're not sure unless you know somebody who was there. Well, he could also be a liar.
Yeah.
But if there's like 100,000 people say that, you know, no, the wall came down in 89. So it's in living memory. Who was around in 89 when the Berlin Wall came down? So 1, 2, 3, 4. You were probably quite young at that time, yes. But who would be old enough to remember it, actually, from the news? Okay, 3 of us here in this room. Okay. So that's how we can look at Papias and Polycarp. They knew people who knew Jesus. Isn't that amazing? So even though they're in the second century, they still knew people who knew Jesus, okay? So and that's also true for the early Christian writings. And I will not give you all that. Actually, when you look at on your app and there's like this outline of mine, you can find some of the name. It's like the Didache. It is the first letter of Clement of Rome, which is probably the first extra New Testament, meaning outside the New Testament, probably written in 96, 97. So very early. And others. The writings, the letters of Ignatius of Antioch and of Polycarp of Smyrna and other people. So these people were very early, and they still knew the first generation, or they knew the second generation of Christians. Which brings us to an very early time, early knowledge, and as we just said, there is a community of remembrance. So sometimes people think that the Gospels were written by somebody on some island where there was nobody else, and he just sat down and wrote his Gospel, and he just took another Gospel and copied some and just took it out of his head. That's total nonsense. They were in a community of memorization. And again, I will not go too much into that. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that we have these sources. And what do the sources now tell us about the faith, the witness, which I would just call the faith now? What did they tell us about the witness? How they witnessed in word, in deed, in their life, and in their community. Because that's where so that's what we can look at, and that's what we want to learn about when we think about how can we communicate the gospel in our times. Now, if you were to put an emphasis on any of these, which one would say at that time the word was most important, meaning what people said or their sharing? Who would say the community was more important in the public witness? And who of you would say it was what they did and how they lived, also individually? So that's where what they did, their deed. Or who would say, no, it's something else. It is actually the power of the Holy Spirit, which was the most important. And I would just call, for now I will call it the Spirit, say signs and wonders, that kind of thing, the charismatic gifts, the exorcisms, the casting out of demons, and so forth. So who would think that in the communicating of the faith in those first centuries, the word was prominent? You can actually raise your hand. Each of you has 2 times that you can raise your hand. So, okay, so just to make it a little bit more interesting. So who would go with the word? Am I too suggestive in the way I present this, that you're all, nobody's for the word? Okay, big mistake. Okay, who is for life and deed? So who's more for that? Okay, we have 1, 2. Okay, you have to give a vote. Okay. You're for the word. Okay, so we have 1 for the word. We have how many for the life and the deed? 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. And who is for the community? 1, 2, 3. And who's for the Spirit? 1, 2, 3. Now the secret charismatics here. 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, you guys are all very good because they're all part and parcel of the whole process, okay? So I'm not going to debate this and I'm not going to evaluate this, okay? Now, when we talk about the word, I would like to, and I'm going to change this over, okay? But before I do that, I want to point out to you that Paul is actually making a distinction like that in Romans 15, verse 18. Some people say the most important chapter in the Epistle of Romans is Romans 3 because it's justification by faith. So I'm being a German and a Lutheran, at least by name, I should say that. Some say, well, it's the most important thing is about what he says about Israel and the church from 9 to 11. Some say, no, it's actually chapter 8, no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, and nothing can separate us from the love of God. But you could also argue that the most important chapter in Romans is the chapter 15, because there he gives the reason why he is writing the letter, and he's also explaining his rationale of mission and how he actually does mission. And he says there, and I will quote from my memory, unless somebody has a Bible that you can open very quickly. Romans 15, verse 18, I will, starting with verse 17, 15, verse 17, 18, I will not talk about anything except for that which Christ has done or wrought through me, that's the old expression, done through me in word and in deed and in the power of the Spirit and signs and wonders. So I often speak about, so Romans 15 verse 18, I say these 3 elements were foremost in Paul's mind as he explained the way that he did his mission, word, work, and wonders. So that's easy to remember. I heard that once from Tom Houston, who was leader of the Lausanne movement many years ago. So word and work and wonders. Now when we look at the word in the early church, we see, so word is content, okay? We see, let me say, the simple, everyday believer. How did they communicate the word, the faith, to their colleagues, to their friends, to their family? So this would be, say, just the witness, word of witness. Now, not everybody at that time had a Bible at their disposal. Rather, almost nobody had a Bible, okay? Because people they didn't have the means. And also by that time, of course, the Bible was mostly the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and then the letters of the New Testament and the Gospels as they were being distributed and recopied. So people would start reading more and more, but they memorized by heart. So there might have been Christians who were believers where their knowledge of the gospel was limited except for the things that they had memorized and what they heard in their gatherings again and again. So that would be the simple believer, but their witness was the most important one. But then there is another stream, And that's what I call the apologia. Apologia. Now this word, of course, means answer or response. And when you come to 1 Peter 3, verse 15, Peter says, always be ready to give an apologia, an answer for the hope that is in you to anyone who asks you. So people were to be ready to give an answer. Why are you doing this? Why are you not beating your wife? Why are you not? Why are you collecting the abandoned children that are in the gutters, that are maybe physically deformed? That's what the early Christians did. They went through Rome and they looked if there was any abandoned children. There's a lot of prostitution going on, and often the women who were involved in prostitution didn't know what to do with their children, so they just let them. And those children would be either just left to die, or they would be collected by someone who ran a brothel to be brought up as a prostitute, or if the children were physically disabled or something, they would just let them die or throw them into the wood to the wild animals. Why do you Christians not do that? That life is certainly inferior. You know, why do you even? No, we take them in, we raise them in our families. So why do you do this? Of course, it's a witness of deed, but here it's an apologia. But the apologia also had another focus, and that was the defense of the faith and the fight against the heretics. So we have in the third phase, we first have the New Testament writers, then we have the early Christian writers, which are often called the Apostolic Fathers. So I call them, right here I call them Apostolic Fathers, but they are early Christian writers, but they are often called Apostolic Fathers. Actually, they should, in my view, be called Post-Apostolic Fathers, because they were not apostolic anymore, but they are called that because they had connections with the apostles like Papias and Papias and Polycarp and so forth. And then there is a third layer which comes about 50 years later. It's overlapping a little bit, and they are the apologists. And these apologists are people like Justin Martyr or Irenaeus of Lyon. And you can look all of these names up and you will find a whole world opening up for each of these guys, okay? So these apologists were those that defended the faith, or they gave an answer, an apologia to the faith, in 2 or 3 different directions. The first direction was to explain to the Christians themselves the meaning of their faith. So that was the first direction. The second direction was to the state and those that persecuted the Christians. So for example, the letter of Diognetus, which is also one of the early Christian writings, often included in that, is addressed to the Roman Empire. And saying, you have heard about this new religion which has sprung up, and you've heard that they're doing all these bad things, like they're eating their children, or they're doing incest. All of that is nonsense, it's not true. Actually, we are very religious people, we are very faithful and just people, and basically explaining the Christian faith to outsiders, okay? And the third thrust of the apologists was to speak against the heretics. And those heretics were coming up in the middle of the 2nd century. They were mostly the Gnostics or Gnostics. Okay, I'm trying to kill myself here. Okay. So let's say the apologists, they were talking to the believers. Let's say, make it easy, so they are talking to the church, they're talking to the state or the public, and they were talking to the heretics. Now, what is heretic? Heretic, of course, means schismatic, or in this case, it often meant the Gnostics, and I'll write that name down for you, or that word. There should be a G. My G never looks like a G, but it's supposed to be one here, the Gnostics. So when we talk about communicating the faith, there's different directions of communication, okay? The communication needs to be to the church itself, because people need to be reminded of the meaning of the faith. So because we're always learners, we never stop learning, and because we forget. Oh no, I'm killing this thing totally. Okay, I'll hold it in my hand now. Well, after the break, we can fix this. We don't need to do it now. I'll hold it in my hands and put this in here. So the church needs to be educated. What is the faith? The society, the state, needs to understand that the Christians are not a threat. And the heretics need to understand, or people need to understand about the heretics, in what way they differ from Orthodox, meaning true historic Christian knowledge, truth and the gospel. But I'm trying to paint a picture which will help you to understand when you go into any of these areas, say the faith, the confession, and I'll speak about that with the Apostles' Creed in a moment, or we talk about the defense over against the Roman society and state, or Greek philosophers, which is another strand of this public apology, or the heretics, which is Gnostics and Marcion and others. But I just want, so where that fits. So where is that in relation to the whole of the early Christian church? Because sometimes when you read books, you think that everything was just about defending the faith apologetically. But that was a big part. And maybe that is a part that is a little bit, at least in my country, in Germany, we do not have many apologists. It seems to me that in other countries, the States, also in the UK and other places, there's apologetics is stronger. But of course, it is only part and parcel of the whole thing of the early Christians.